Well, so the first thing I should do is thank Frederick, Chu, and Esther Go, whom many of you have been corresponding with about this event. Thank you so much. I'll be thanking them over and over every time I get up on my hind legs and say something to the group. Thank you again. Yeah, let's... we're here to celebrate Peter's birthday. I think we should do this every year, but I'll be taking volunteers for, who will organize the next one. But we'll talk more about Peter later. We spread this thing out over 3 days. Originally, I was thinking, okay, we'll just do 2 intense days full of talks, and I'll just invite a bunch of people who, for whom Peter has been important in their work, or they've been students of his, and then we'll have, or something, and we'll have some Rutgers people speak as well. Well, everybody said yes, and not everybody could make those 2 days in October, so we just decided to spread it over 3. So people will be coming and going. And everybody will get to see Peter and be here for some of it anyway. So I'm going to start, let's see, are there any announcements and things that I need to make at this point? I don't think so. Well, this morning there won't be a coffee break outside the room here. There is a cafe across. If you go out the back door and go to the left. Tomorrow, there'll be breakfast here, starting at what time? 9, I think? Ish. It probably says on that schedule. But there'll be breakfast here, and coffee breaks, and lunch, and so on. So if you want to factor that into your plans. Okay, let me start this talk. I originally wasn't so taken by what Peter said about universals, but the more I thought about it, the more I read, and reread his papers about it, the better I liked it, and I liked it even better when it seemed like it could be fit nicely together with a sort of divine conceptualism about properties. So that's what I'm going to try to do today, is show how Peter can help us put together Platonic or some kind of realism about universals and divine aseity and dependence. So on the handout, we'll start with section A here. There are views about universals according to which there's lots and lots of them, and there's views about universals according to which there's just a few. And this is because people are using universals to do different things, play different roles. For some roles, you need tons of them, as many as you can get. For other roles, you just want a few to do the job. These are different jobs, so you may want both jobs to be done by some things, and they may be different things that do the jobs. So I'm going to talk about the motivations for a plenitudinous view of universals, the motivations for a more sparse view of universals, and I want to try to show that both of them, if you have things playing both roles, that's great. That kind of realism about universals seems to me compatible with this thesis AD on the handout, which is aseity dependence. Got 2 parts. If God, first of all, God's existence doesn't depend on anything distinct from God, and secondly, everything that's distinct from God depends on God's creative activity for its existence. And people have thought that that kind of view is incompatible with realism about universals for reasons that will emerge. Okay, so section B, Peter van Inwagen's path to plenitude. Really, it's many, many people's paths to plenitudes of universals, but then I want to focus on some things Peter says about the plenitude of universals that he gets. Lots of people believe in, or at least continue to talk about freely, universals or general ideas or something because of the indispensability, the seeming indispensability of abstract reference. So if you've got a statement that contains a name or some expression that looks like it's a term for a single entity, it's natural to assume that if the statement's true, it must be referring to something. And most philosophers aren't happy just making assertions willy-nilly about things that they regard as non-existent. And if they do, you've got neo-Quinians like Peter to come around and pester the person with questions about what that word is doing if they think they're making true statements and yet they think there's no such thing, right? Peter takes Quine's remarks about paraphrasing away reference to abstracta and turns them into, kind of makes them more precise as a kind of strategy for, so you've got him talking about a criterion of ontological commitment. Peter says, this is a strategy for figuring out what somebody else's ontological commitments are. It's a strategy that requires a kind of negotiation with the other person. Quine's way of doing it was, well, force the other person to represent her theory in the canonical notation of first-order predicate logic, eliminate names and other singular terms altogether. Since statements that begin with the existential quantifier are equivalent to there exists an X such that, you can sort of read the theory's commitments off of the quantifiers, essentially. The things that have to satisfy the variables for the theory to be true are what you're committed to. The difficulty of providing Quinian paraphrases for abstract reference provides a familiar reason to posit many, many universals. So any general term you like, being hungry, Dean is hungry, you've got hunger. Dean is courageous, you've got courage. You've got all these terms, and you've got some statements using them that seem hard they seem true, but they're hard to express in any way that avoids abstract reference. So, Dean has the property of being hungry, or the property of hunger. That doesn't seem so hard to paraphrase away. Dean is hungry. That's all you're saying. But if you say the most important thing that everybody on the desert island had in common was hunger, well, that seems like you're saying of all the properties that they had, the one property that was the most important was hunger. It's very hard to get rid of that apparent mention of properties. And of course, more generally, the success of semantics, which talks about meanings of sentences and individual words, including general words, abstract terms. The success of mathematics, which talks about numbers. It's very hard to see how to paraphrase all this stuff away. There are tricks, of course, but let's suppose they don't work. Okay. So if these are our reasons for positing universals, we need a lot of them. And as Peter points out in his defense of the existence of universals along these lines, this doesn't tell us what role they play precisely. It doesn't tell us what their nature is exactly. He takes them to be transcendent universals, that is, They're not around here. They're not like, like some realists about universals will say, there's the redness right there on the chair, and it's reflecting light, and there it is again, and there it is again. It's all over the place, and it's located where its instances are. Peter says, no, it doesn't really make sense to suppose these things are like that. So they're not in space and time. We can ascribe them to things, but that's the bulk of what we know about them. One of the important things he says about them is that they don't explain why predications are true. So if you have a simple predication of something, you say, that chair is red. Well, yeah, there must be redness, and the chair must have it. But the chair standing in the exemplification relation to the property of redness doesn't explain why that chair is red. And it's a mistake to say that this is a claim about a relation that the chair stands in to redness. When I say the chair is red, I'm not talking about exemplification at all. So we have, so that's what he says. You can see how it would be obviously true on certain theories about universals, theories different from his own, like, for instance, the idea that we need all these universals, but sets can play that role. So the set of all the red things, we need that thing. It can do work for us when we're doing semantics for statements about things, when we're describing them as red. So we need it, but it's just the set of all the red things. If that's your view, then you'd think that schemas like this are generally valid. X is red if and only if X has redness, if and only if X is a member of the set of red things. But this reason for positing the set of all the red things wouldn't lead us, or shouldn't lead us, to say X is belonging to a certain set explains why it is red, or explains what it is to be red. It belongs in the set because it's red. Right, not the other way around. So the friends of sets as universals should deny that Solomon is wise. This is in the middle of page 2 of, I don't know. This is on your handout anyway. Should deny that Solomon is wise expresses a relational proposition with Solomon and the set of wise things for its subjects and set membership as its relation. The sentence isn't about set membership at all. Solomon's being wise is not explained by Solomon's membership in this set. What it is to be wise is not to belong to that set, nor is Solomon wise because of membership in that set. Now, Peter does not identify universals with sets, but with his transcendent universals. But he sees no more reason to regard relations to his plenitudinous universals as explaining why things are the way they are. And nor does he see why we should take the simplest subject-predicate sentences as expressing relational propositions. If transcendent realism of Peter's sort indeed implies that the proposition that Solomon was wise is a relational proposition, then it's easy to see, and this is a quotation now from Peter, then it's easy to see why one should not be a transcendent realist. That proposition is obviously not a relational proposition. For no object X and no relation R is that proposition the proposition that R holds between Solomon and X. The only object that in any way figures in the proposition that Solomon was wise is Solomon. That proposition says of that object, Solomon, that it, or he, is wise, but in saying that of him, it does not affirm that there is some other object, some object that exists independently of him, even if that object be one that is in some way logically or semantically or ontologically intimately connected with the predicate wise, to which he bears some relation, having or any other relation. Now, David Armstrong is the person that Peter's pushing back against here. David argues against transcendent universals, partly on the grounds that they make even the simplest propositions relational. Peter replies that Armstrong needs, quote, a premise that implies that a relation more intimate than mere necessary coextensiveness holds between pairs of predicates like is wise and has the property of being wise. And then the point of that is that he needs something like that for the argument that these even simple predications are expressing relational propositions. It would require a principle like this, and this is a quotation on the handout. Insert corner quotes because my technological abilities have petered out. For any term A and any predicate F, if A denotes a concrete particular that belongs to the extension of F, then the sentence, what it is for A to be F is for it to have the property of being F, expresses a true proposition. And there's other alternatives that he offers. Armstrong could be appealing to principles like A's being F consists in A's having the property of being F. Or A's being F is grounded in A's having the property of being F. A is F in virtue of A's having the property of being F. A is F because A has the property of being F. And none of these, he thinks, is plausible, and certainly not required by his reasons for positing universals. Another quote from Peter. Consider the last of these alternatives, the one that says A is F because A has the property of being F. Although because is a tricky word, I think that it is closer to the truth to say that the Taj Mahal has the property of being white because it is white than it is to say that the Taj Mahal is white because it has the property of being white. Aristotle has famously said, it is not because we think truly that you are white or pale that you are white, but because you are white, we who say this have the truth. Similarly, one might say, it is not because whiteness is truly predicable of you that you are white, but because you are white, whiteness is truly predicable of you. So, to sum up, some of the reasons to posit plenitudes of universals, the reasons that we've just canvassed, are reasons to believe in things that play a certain ubiquitous role. It need be no part of that role that the having of these properties explains why the things that have them are the way they are. Okay. Another reason to believe in something that people have called universals leads to a sparse theory of universals. So here's a contrasting reason to posit something that people have often called universals. Some groups of objects objectively resemble one another in a single respect, and they may be said to form a natural class. One role of universals is simply to provide metaphysical grounds for an objective distinction between the natural classes and the unnatural or heterogeneous classes. Members of a perfectly natural class have something in common, namely a single universal on this way of thinking. Heterogeneous groups of objects do not. I'm assuming almost everybody here has read New Work for a Theory of Universals or knows Armstrong's, the work that Armstrong puts them to and others. So this is a different reason, obviously, and it leads to a sparse theory of universals that explain objective similarities. When you have a perfectly natural class and you say the thing that's special about it is that every member has the same universal, well, when X exemplifies that kind of universal, that explains why it is the way it is. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Famously, people who try to get out of positing universals in this way, making use of resemblance relations, overall resemblance relations among objects, they run into problems. So the Carnapian way of defining naturalness of class in terms of the members all resembling one another runs into problems. And Goodman called one of them the companionship problem, when you have properties that are coextensive. and the imperfect community problem, when you have patterns of similarity where everything has a property in common with every other thing, but they're not all the same properties, essentially. Okay. How to get out of those puzzles for someone who wants to use resemblance and avoid a universal present in every instance? Well, there's different ways. One way is to posit an extra kind of thing, namely tropes. And I know, where's Karen? I said tropes. There, I said it. Karen's sick and tired of tropes. But we all have to admit, people posit them. And Peter and Karen can make fun of them all day long. I remember spending, I feel like it was the better part of a day, trying to get Peter to at least, if not believe in tropes, at least just kind of see their value, right? And that he could maybe understand what people were talking about when they talked about tropes. I'm not going to try that here. Doesn't matter for my purposes. And I'm not sure that I believe in tropes. But they certainly help if you're trying to define having a property in common, being a perfectly natural class, in terms of resemblance. Because now, for instance, obviously the coextensiveness problem just goes away. If all the red things happen to be spheres, and all the spheres happen to be red, well, you'd still have the redness trope and the roundness trope, the spherical trope, and you just take the classes of perfectly resembling tropes and exactly resembling tropes, and those will do duty for your most fundamental aspects of resemblance, your sets of things that resemble one another in one perfectly precise way. Others, if you don't like tropes, then you might well posit universals present in each instance. And if you do, you might well, like Aristotle, arguably, put them right where their instances are. Armstrong, at least at one stage, did this as well. If redness were perfectly fundamental and that shade were one of the perfectly precise shades, it would be all over the place. Okay, and on a trope view, the universal, the particularized universals, or whatever you want to call them, are bundled right into their instances and explain the nature of the thing. On both of these kinds of theories about objective resemblance, it's very natural to be a bundle theorist, because you've got your universals or your surrogates for universals right in space and time explaining the nature of the thing that has them. So why do you need some further thing? Just bundle them together. Okay, so the importance of the bundle theory is just that if you could have a bundle that contained just one trope or just one of these perfectly natural universals, that bundle would not be distinct from that universal. And it's the only one there. If there could be such a thing, it would be identical to the property or the trope, according to a bundle theorist. And you would explain its having that property in terms of it simply being that property or that trope. And this, of course, is what the doctrine of divine simplicity says about the relationship between God and God's nature, divinity. They are one and the same. Okay, now let's talk about this general worry about how to put a theory that's got universals together with that aseity dependence thesis. If universals are also necessarily existing and self-existent, that they too exist a se in themselves, alongside of God, then the doctrine of aseity insofar as it includes also dependence of everything else on God, is false. Wouldn't that diminish God's uniqueness to accept the existence of things not dependent upon God, which exist with as much inevitability? And there's certainly plenty of people around writing more than one book at a time, arguing that this is true. And if somebody accepts the existence of necessarily existing universals, they can't believe that they depend upon God. And if they do that, they might as well be atheists. I didn't include any quotes like that on here, but I could find them for you. Well, that seems a little much, but I think it's not that hard to see how to put both Peter's plenitudinous universals and Armstrong's sort of sparse universals that explain objective resemblance, accept all of that and avoid the arguments that are supposed to create a problem. Okay. You avoid the problems by saying that the plenitudinous universals do depend upon God, that they are somehow ideas in God's mind. As Augustine, of course, is famous for holding this sort of view, and it was the orthodox view amongst the medieval Christian tradition, and other monotheistic traditions as well. So now, can we really make sense of the idea that there are ideas in God's mind? Would ideas in God's mind play the right kind of role? Well, what role do they need to play? Let's think about the set theoretic believer in quote unquote universals. My universals are just sets of things. I need them to do semantics. I need them to express things about when things have things in common and so on. But I don't need them to, if you're the set theory sort of person, you're not explaining the natures of things in terms of these sets. Well, what are sets anyway? They're kind of mysterious, There's all you, and then there's the set of all of you. What's the difference? It's kind of hard to tell the difference. There's my wallet, and there's the unit set of my wallet. Well, I pick them both up. Can I pick up a unit set? I don't know. They're kind of hard to understand what these things are anyway. Normally we talk about groups as things that we single out or collect somehow. So maybe it's better to understand sets in terms of collecting things in thought. But of course, none of us can do the job that a plenitudinous theory of universals would need to be done, collecting things. There's just too many. So maybe God does that sort of work. Al Plantinga proposed something like this once, and Chris Menzel developed an interesting kind of explanatory argument for the existence of God. God's needed to do some collecting. I won't try to repeat that here, but I'm getting attracted to this idea too. I'm getting attracted to all these ideas I once would have dismissed so quickly. Maybe this is, I don't know what this says. You can tell me what this says about me later. Privately, take me aside, Dean. You need to stop drinking so much coffee. It seemed to me that God's collecting things, or God's disposition to collect things in thought, could help explain things like how there can be differences between sets of things that don't exist, like unicorns and centaurs. So if God's disposition, if God's always got the disposition to think of, whenever there's some things, to think of them together, unless, of course, it's too big. But if there's not too many of them, if there are such things, God thinks of them together, and then boom, you get the set of them. God would have different dispositions towards collecting centaurs together and collecting unicorns together. So you could say things like, X is red if and only if X belongs to the collection resulting from God's disposition to gather red things. And possibly X is a unicorn if and only if X could belong to a set resulting from God's disposition to gather unicorns. Nothing has that property, but there are distinct dispositions to collect things that don't exist. Well, I don't know. Never mind that. Maybe I'm just blowing smoke there. But the idea that somehow the plenitudinous universals depend upon God's mind is an ancient one, and I think I see some ways to motivate it. And I think it gives us a way to respond to some obvious tensions that arise for any form of divine activism, where God is somehow generating the universals. Here's Brian Leftow evoking a kind of sense of the problem. God's essential attributes, this is on your handout there, God's essential attributes exist only if God creates them, but God can create them only if he instances them, and he instances them only if they exist. So it seems that to activism, the idea that that universals depend upon God, God's mind, God's attributes coming to exist presuppose that they already exist. But if they already exist, how can they then be created? That is, for activism, these attributes existing is a causally necessary condition for their existing. That seems kind of bad. Ultimately, I think Leftow's solution is to deny that God creates God's essential attributes while affirming that God generates all other abstracta. And in fact, that's not far from the proposal that I'm proposing, the proposal I'm floating. So the view that I think can avoid these sorts of worries is, one, God generates plenitudinous universals, and despite the fact that necessarily X is F if and only if X has Fness, nevertheless, X as having Fness does not explain X as being F. That's going to enable us to avoid these kinds of worries. And secondly, God also creates all the sparse universals that explain similarities, perhaps by creating their instances, except for God's own essential attributes, of which there is in fact only one. On a bundle theory of the relationship between sparse nature-explaining universals and individuals, an individual is not to be distinguished from the bundle of its nature-explaining properties, and so the bundle consisting of God's one property is not to be distinguished from God. And so the aseity dependence thesis with which we began is satisfied. So I'm going to, what's left here, let's see, we started about 10 minutes late. When is this supposed to end? Anyone have a, yes, my conference. Yeah, I know, but supposed to, when? 10:45? Okay, good. So I think we'll have time to look at these arguments quickly. Two arguments that there's a sort of circularity involved with supposing the plenitudinous universals depend upon God, and then an argument that that God's nature, since it must be a property, would have to be dependent upon God in some way that's circular. That original aseity dependence thesis that I put on the handout there, that a number of people have said things like that, articulated it in those terms. Bergman and Brouwer, for instance, I think I took it from them. I've got a long quote here from them in which they argue that divine activism runs into a terrible circularity problem. I'm going to spare you the quote because they, barring further thought on their part, they accept my formulation of their argument. So we'll just go straight to my formulation of their argument. Chris Menzel wrote a paper where he tried to interpret their argument, and his interpretation of it is quite a lot more complex than mine. So it's got that going for it as well. So I'm going to reconstruct the argument under the assumption that the relation that they appeal to of logical priority, the thing that can't go round in a circle, holds between facts. Brackets around a sentence are going to generate names for facts. So brackets around P is a name for the fact that P. Fact names that include variables, which we're going to need some of those, are replaceable by names for facts that result from replacing the variables with names for any admissible substitutions for the variables. So for all x, the fact that x is f is prior to the fact that p is a way of asserting the fact that a is f is prior to p, and the fact that b is f is prior to p, and so on. Okay, I think that's about all we need. The argument turns upon the transitivity and asymmetry of priority and two doctrines about which facts are prior to which other facts. And these doctrines are, first, properties explain predicational facts. The following schema is valid. The fact that x has the property being f is prior to the fact that x is f. So that's the claim that having a property explains why you're the way you are. Having the property of being red explains why you're red, in some sense of explanation. Ability priority. The fact that x is able to create f's is prior to the fact that x creates some f or other. Okay? So that's what we need for this argument. The Bergman-Brouwer argument for incompatibility of aseity and plenitudinous explanatory realism. First premise is the assumption that being able to create properties is a property and God has it. For any x, if x is a property, then the fact that God creates some property or other is prior to the fact that x exists. And I think that is, it's reasonably a consequence of aseity dependence on kind of causal grounds. So the fact that God creates some property or other is prior to being able to create properties, the fact that being able to create properties exists. Now we appeal to ability priority. The fact that God is able to create properties is prior to the fact that God creates some property or other. And then we appeal to the idea that properties explain predicational facts. The fact that God has the property being able to create properties is prior to the fact that God is able to create properties. So you put those all together, you put 4 and 5 together with the transitivity of priority, and you get 6. The fact that God has the property being able to create properties is prior to the fact that God creates some property or other. For any x and y, if x is a property and y has x, then the fact that x exists is prior to the fact that y has x. Where did that come from? That looks like properties explain predicational facts. Right. That's the general statement of that. Is that right? No. I guess that's maybe we can talk about that, where that comes from. It doesn't seem crazy to me. It has that glow, right? 8, being able to create properties exists is prior to, that fact is prior to the fact that God has the property being able to create properties. That comes from 1 and 7. Then we get 9 by transitivity again, from 8 and 6. The fact that being able to create properties exists is prior to the fact that God creates some property or other. And then we have a contradiction between 9 and 3. Okay. Trust me, this is much simpler than Chris Menzel's reconstruction of their argument. And Chris Menzel's reconstruction of their argument was a plausible one. So you could go back and look at the quote and see how it maps on there. But this is roughly how their argument goes. You could obviously reject the assumption we started with. You could deny that being able to create properties is a property. But, of course, if you believe in plenitudes of universals, you're not going to deny that. And if you believe in God, you're not going to deny that God has it, if you're an activist about universals. So you can't do that. You could deny aseity dependence or deny that 2 is a consequence of it. But let's not do that. Ability priority seems pretty good to me. And I guess transitivity and asymmetry seem okay, although that's where Chris Menzel digs in and quite plausibly says, wait a minute, there's a bunch of different kinds of priority going on here. There seems like there's a kind of causal priority, and also there's a kind of kind of deeper metaphysical explanation sort of priority. Maybe you can't, maybe there's no general priority relation that can be appealed to. But never mind all that. Given the kind of view that Peter has about universals, we are going to deny the idea that properties explain predicational facts. So we just deny 5. And then we're done, right? So in fact, I think premise 5 is the weakest link here, though I understand you could balk at the principles about this priority relation, but we don't even have to worry about that if our reasons for believing in plenitudinous universals are the ones that Peter likes. Okay. Because you might have these worries about logical priority, whether there's really a single relation here, it might be good to take a relation that is more clearly a single thing, or a relation that a whole bunch of people believe in and have been studying a lot lately. So let's try to produce a similar kind of argument using grounding. This should, we're in medieval metaphysics land here. Grounding is exactly the sort of thing they would have loved. And the extensive, sometimes Baroque explorations of grounding that people have been doing in the last 15 or so years would have made them all happy. Okay. Jonathan, Kit Fine, Karen Bennett, Ted, a lot of people in this room. Trenton on truth making. I don't know. There's a lot of people doing grounding and truth making and stuff in this room, and some of the most important people working on those topics are here. So let's see if there's a version that works with a good because connective, a because that's a sort of grounding connective. I'll use because to express a relation between propositions, a metaphysical kind of because, true at least partly in virtue of, or at least partially grounded in. It's factive. If P because Q, then P and Q. Now I'm going to assume this relation is transitive. Jonathan has argued that grounding isn't transitive, but there's a lot of different grounding relations going around, and it's controversial what the most fundamental one is, the best one, and so on. With grounding understood as an explanatory relationship between true propositions or facts, I think it is fairly plausible to suppose that it's transitive. At least there's plausible things that can be said against the proposed counterexamples to transitivity. And there's a footnote there to Litland, who's said some of these things. So let's suppose we've got a grounding relation that is transitive. Then plenitudinous explanatory realism could be this thesis. Necessarily, for every possible non-paradoxical attribution of a predicate F to something, there exists a property P that something has if and only if it is F, and if X is F, then X is F because X has P. And a kind of ability priority thesis also seems plausible using this grounding connective. It's never the case that X has the ability to do such and such because X in fact does such and such. It's the other way around. Ability precedes act. So then we can put together this kind of argument. Premise 1, God is able to generate properties because the property being able to generate properties exists. That comes from the plenitudinous explanatory realism. 2, the property being able to generate properties exists because God generates the property being able to generate properties. That's our aseity dependence thesis. 3, God is able to generate properties because God generates the property being able to generate properties. Transitivity of because. It's not the case that God is able to generate properties because God generates the property being able to generate properties. That's ability priority. This is a quicker way of doing the kind of thing that Brouwer and Bergman were trying to do. And again, the solution is simple: deny the explanatory part of plenitudinous explanatory realism. Universals have a job, they have a role, but they need not all explain in this way. All right. Finally, let me turn to the question, does God have a nature, and a kind of problem that threatens if you think God generates all the properties, including even the ones that you've posited just a few of, to explain the real natures of things. So here's a worry that arises for realism and divine aseity from the idea that if realism is true, God would depend upon something else, namely God's nature. This worry doesn't go away simply by rejecting plenitudinous explanatory realism, but only upon the assumption that some things have properties which make them to be the kind of thing they are, explaining similarities and differences, and that God is one of them. Suppose God has a nature, call it divinity, and that it is a natural property that makes God to be who God is. This is not so because of some generalized realism about properties, but because everything must have a nature, and the nature of a thing explains why it is like it is. Doesn't this run into trouble with aseity as well? Some have tried to say that God creates God's nature, but they've been accused of introducing a kind of divine bootstrapping. And that seems right to me. That is divine bootstrapping, and I don't think even God can do that. So we can construct an argument, a grounding-based argument, along these lines. Premise 1, God is divine because God exemplifies divinity. That comes from the idea that everything has a nature. God exemplifies divinity because the property divinity exists. Is Anil here? Anil? Thank you. I needed that. This argument was a little messed up. that follows from the idea that relational facts depend upon the relata. 3, the property of divinity exists because God generates divinity. That's our aseity dependence thesis. So you put those together with transitivity of because, and you get God is divine because God generates divinity. Now, if God's nature should explain what God can do, then we get 5. God is able to generate divinity because God is divine. 6, we apply transitivity to because again, and from 4 and 5 we get God is able to generate divinity because God generates divinity. But it's not true that God is able to generate divinity because God generates divinity. That's the ability priority thesis, and then we get a contradiction. So we got to pick one of 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 to deny. Some people have said 1 is false. God does not have a nature. Defenders of divine simplicity can say, well, no, 1 is true. God does have a nature. But exemplifies just means is. On a bundle theory, with 1 property in the bundle, that's all there is to the thing. That's the limiting case of a bundle. The relation is improper parthood, that is identity. So they can deny 3. It's not in fact supported by aseity because divinity just is God, and the aseity dependence thesis doesn't say that God has to be self-generating in order to be self-existent. It just says everything else has to depend upon God. So there's a combination of views about universals that seems appealing to me. The aseity dependence thesis and the idea that universals are in some way dependent upon God, God's mind, also is appealing to me. The bundle theory in general doesn't appeal to me, but maybe for things which, like Highlander, there can be only 1, maybe it's okay for them. So I don't know. I'm not seeing anything wrong with it. That'll be your job in the time remaining. So thanks.
You get the impression that, from what you've said, that I have offered reasons for positing the existence of platitudinous universals, right? But I don't think I've ever offered in my life reasons for positing anything. You know, what I've offered is arguments for, first of all, for the conclusion that the beliefs we bring to philosophy entail the existence of universals, or at least that a certain role is filled, and then trying to do metaphysical analysis to find out the nature of the things that could play that role. I say some things about them. One of them is that these things are things people could say about things, and right. That these are, as I say, anetiological, which means they can't enter into causal relations, so they can't be created. So then, what about this idea, though, that there are ideas in God's mind? If so, I don't suppose maybe we don't create our ideas, but
generate somehow.
You think so, and yet, so one of my ideas is the idea of the transitivity of identity. It's one of your ideas too. It's one of God's ideas. It's a universal. As far as I know, all the ideas in my mind, your mind, or God's mind are universals. Of course, if you're not a Platonist, if you're an Aristotelian, you'll think there are these particulars there maybe that are ideas in your mind, but that's certainly not something that makes any sense to me. So I think we've got a lot more to say about lots of things in there, but that's probably enough to start with.
Okay. Yeah. So I didn't mean to be attributing to you anything other than giving us arguments for the conclusion that we can't get along without universals.
We already
Okay,
believe in that.
right. Yeah. Okay. So I think if it sounded like I was attributing something else to you, we can just take that back. But if someone gives you an argument to think that something that you believe commits you to the existence of a so-and-so, that gives you a reason to accept a conclusion that you might not have believed previously. You hadn't noticed it, perhaps. Now, as to whether ideas in God's mind could be the sort of thing to play the role that is needed, I don't know. Maybe they can't. I just know a lot of people have thought they could.
I just meant you have to be an Aristotelian to believe that. A Platonist is not going to believe that.
So, there was certainly a well-trodden path from views that were called Platonism to the view that those things that Plato believed in, you know what they are? They're ideas in God's mind.
Platonist, you mean somebody like Plato, sure.
Yeah.
But if you mean a Platonist in the sense in which, say, Goodman doesn't want to be a Platonist.
Yeah. I don't have much more useful to say about the actual thesis of divine conceptualism or divine activism about the universals. So I think my stuff about God's dispositions, that's the best I can do, and I'm not even very happy with that right now. So yeah, that's and God thinks them up. But there's bootstrapping there, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, Jonathan.
Thanks, Dean. That was very cool. I think this is going to be a supportive comment. I wanted to offer you a different way out of the Bergman-Brouwer argument and the grounding variant of the argument that doesn't go through denying properties explain predicational facts, but rather it goes through denying the ability priority, which is the idea that God is able to create properties as logically prior to God creates some property or other. And I think it's important here to distinguish between sort of logical generation and logical presupposition. So consider the examples of the Socrates is wise and something is wise. It's pretty standard, certainly on the sort of the grounding theoretic side of the ledger, to think that Socrates is wise is the prior one, and the reason why, or at least part of the reason why something is wise is because Socrates is wise, and maybe the other wise individuals can contribute also to the holding of that existential. But of course, there's a sense in which Socrates is wise logically presupposes something is wise. If it weren't the case that something is wise, of course it couldn't be the case that Socrates is wise.
Right.
So this kind of logical relation where if one proposition is false, the other couldn't be true, doesn't show logical priority. It at most shows, in the generational sense, it at most shows logical presupposition. So I'd want to think of the relationship between God creates a property and God has the ability to create a property as at least potentially falling under the logical presupposition side. Of course, for God to create something, we're presupposing that he's able to create. But it's not as if God first has to have the ability and only then can spring into action. It is sort of God just springs into action, and that might be, maybe that's the grounds for his having the ability, or maybe there co-grounded in something else. But we don't have to think of the ability, of the action as grounded in the ability. It can merely be that there's a presupposition.
Yeah.
And that's sort of just to finish the thought, like there's at least a view, you might not like the view, but it's out there, that in general the modal, and the sort of can and has the abilities of modal fact, you might think that you might like the view that the modal facts ought to be grounded in the categorical facts or the totality of categorical facts. If you like anything in that vicinity, you'll want the actions to come before the abilities.
Yeah. Good. I think when we switch from the logical priority version that they, when we switch from the logical priority version to the grounding version, it what you're saying feels like it's the right thing to say. And I guess in the logical priority case, I feel like I may not have enough of a grasp on that to know what to, whether it goes differently. But anyway, I appreciate that. Okay.
I think maybe one way to understand what Jonathan's calling logical presupposition is maybe just entailment. Is that okay? So if Socrates is wise, that entails that something is wise.
Well, yeah.
One way to understand the logical presupposition, I think, might be necessary implication or entailment. So Socrates is wise entails that something is wise. You're already committed to saying entailment doesn't commit you to any kind of grounding or explanatory relation.
Right, and nobody who's giving these arguments would want
to. But I'm saying Jonathan was just pointing out another place where you might make that same move. So I think Jonathan's is a friendly comment, but I think it's in a way just another version of your denying the explanatory realism while accepting the entailment.
Okay, it's in the ball. I can see it's in the ballpark of that. Yeah, Laurie.
Okay, so thanks. So this is I enjoyed this paper. I kind of have a question for you, really, and that is, I'm interested in this interaction between causal relations and metaphysical dependence, and then when you shift to the discussion of grounding, and you use your connective because, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that, and here's why. If somebody wants to make a sharp distinction between like dependence relations and causal relations, they might think there are kind of two uses of because that go along with this. And one kind of because is involving ontological dependence shouldn't be transitive because we're not using the same kind of notion of explanation as we would when we're doing causal explanation. Some of this is also because I always feel a little confused about, are we doing semantics or are we doing we're talking about like pa facts, right? Because if we're doing something with semantics, then I want to say because it's got to be transitive and it's explanatory in a kind of causally way. But if we're not, then how we use because could be different. See, I thought you're looking at me like, see, I'm confused about how you want to think about that, and maybe you think that the distinctions I want to make here you want to deny those.
I feel like I'm playing around with arguments that people have given, looking for plausible interpretations of what they mean by logical priority or some kind of transitive dependence relation that's creating this big problem. And I'm not sure that they've found one. So the problem with these arguments might be that there's just a bunch of different relations floating around here, and we're kind of swapping them in, and swapping them in and out.
Yeah,
And
I'm worried about that. Yeah.
So I hear you.
So okay, so then I could reframe it by saying it might be worth thinking about the rejection of one could be interpreted. There are different ways to reject it, and maybe one has to reject all of the ways to be able to reject it. I'm just kind of
Yeah.
building on what you're saying. There's a suggestion for thinking about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right that for some of these relations, transitivity seems right. For others, it doesn't.
This is a thought about the grounding argument at the bottom of page 7. I keep expecting this mic to amplify. It's unclear to me that ability priority actually plays any role in the paradox. It looks like we can just drop it, and we've still got problems. And this suggests that, in fact, your solution denying plenitudinous explanatory realism is the sort of thing we'll have to do. So the thought is there's a paradox that goes like this.
This is the Bergman-Brouwer argument. My reconstruction of that one.
Let's see, the one at the bottom of 7, the grounding.
My hand. I don't have my hand out here,
Well,
so
this is
got
the
it.
four premise
Yep.
argument. So the thought is you can get a paradox going even without ability priority, because you can say, look, the first premise is that God generates some properties because the property of being such that you generate properties exists. So that's plenitudinous explanatory realism. And then AD says that that property, being such that you generate properties, exists because God generates some properties. And so then given those two things, you'll get a cycle. So if you deny that grounding is cyclic, if you say that it's acyclic, then you've got a paradox even without bringing abilities into the picture. So it's a comment that also comes with a question. So maybe there's a reason that you need ability priority and I'm not seeing it. Or maybe this is just how the argument's sort of been posed in the literature.
I think I was finding that premise being actively appealed to in the Bergman-Brouwer text. And so I gave it a role to play too. But I think you may be right about that. Which may affect the kind of thing Jonathan was saying about ability priority not being plausible using this notion of grounding. If we don't have to appeal to that premise, we might have a grounding relation that creates a problem and bypasses that.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah, the argumentation is a bit alien to me because I'm intentionalist about facts, but I'll just make a little observation I was noticing about I'm an intentionalist about facts, which changes the game a lot, but I'll leave that to, I just want to make a little observation about the Bergman-Brouwer that I was noticing, which is if you think that existence is a self-exemplifying property, which is not that bad, then looks like you better not have your premise 7 and the premise that properties explain predicational facts, because I could take as my values for x and y existing and existing, and then I'll run through what happens. I go for if existing is a property, then existing has existence, and existing has existence, which you get by the self-exemplification of existence, which is my other premise. Then x exists is prior to existing has existence. But that's exactly the wrong order for someone who buys properties explain predicational facts, you see? So it's not as it brings out one way it's not as innocuous as you think, this extra premise 7. You've got to be very careful with that premise. In fact, it's incompatible with properties explain predicational facts on that extra little premise that I gave you.
I'll put a big red warning sign next to that.
All right, thanks. I wanted to also ask about that argument, and in particular, premise 5. So I'm not very inclined to accept properties explain predicational facts, but I would have accepted the identity of claims like X is red and X has the of facts like X is being read and X is having the property of being read. And it seems like even if you accept that identity, the argument would go through. So, I mean, just replace premise 5 with those two facts are identical with one another. Yes, sorry, page 6 on the handout, the Bergman-Brouwer. So if you had an identity claim instead of a priority claim, it looks like the argument would still work.
Peter's kind of lightweight view about universals and their role motivates his denial that that kind of identity is true. The one proposition or fact is relational and involves exemplification and so on. The other one is not.
Yeah. So, sorry, I just wanted to point out that I guess at least by my lights, rejecting the sort of priority claim is pretty plausible, but it's not. You need something more than that. I mean, I think Juby and some other people have defended kind of the identity of those sorts of facts, and you would need to reject that too to escape the argument.
All right, so we'll take a brief break, and let's start at